This is the Acer XB273, a 27-inch gaming monitor that comes in a variety of different formats and panel options and refresh rates. This one I have here is the GX model, which means that it is a 27-inch 1080p 240Hz IPS panel with G-Sync compatibility. Sounds like a bit of a strange setup, right? 240Hz, but 1080p at 27 inches, but also an IPS panel, and they even marked it as having a Delta E color accuracy of less than 2, which is ideal for color-sensitive work. But again, it's a 1080p, 27-inch, 240Hz panel, so who is this for? The obvious answer here is gamers, right? Any 1080p 240Hz panel, no matter what size it is still going to be a very good time for the sorts of people who main CSGO. Now, for me personally, because this is a 27-inch 1080p panel, the pixel density isn't for me. I can physically see each individual pixel in the little up arrow in the Windows taskbar, and that just shows you how easy it is to see the pixels on the screen, and so that detracts from the experience more than I would perhaps like it to be. Now, I can see one use case where having a 27-inch 1080p 240Hz monitor in general makes sense, and that's if you do main games like CSGO, having your enemies show up on screen as physically larger thanks to the larger size of the display, but still get the benefit of both the ultra high refresh rates and the fact that you're rendering the frame at 1080p instead of, say, 1440p. You get the extra performance of that sort of lower resolution, and so you can still make the best use out of the 240Hz panel. Now, since we're talking about playing on CSGO, let's have a little play. I found that this was incredibly smooth, as are most 240Hz panels. It was a very, buttery smooth experience. And while, as always, I can't say that I can tell the difference between 144 and 240Hz, knowing that I'm seeing updates, seeing new frames 3 milliseconds faster and getting more information to my brain is a nice thing to know that's happening, even if I can't necessarily see it in person. I did notice that there was a couple of times where on the more sort of reaction time based shots, I struggled to, land the hits. Things like in the double doors on Dust 2, normally I would hit at least one of the enemies running by, but this time I pretty much didn't hit them at all. Now, I did have a pretty good time in the more close combat scenarios. I actually felt a little bit better about it, which could be down to both the higher refresh rate and the physically larger players, and so it's a little bit easier to target. But overall, it was a pretty decent, incredibly smooth experience, and it was pretty enjoyable. So knowing that the gaming experience is pretty decent, didn't blow me away, but certainly good enough, let's take a look at the benchmark results and see what it's actually doing, what's actually going on. Starting with response time, Acer claims that this is a 1 millisecond monitor. And I think if you were to set the overdrive mode to extreme, the highest setting, and enable the variable backlight or backlight strobing, which unfortunately can't be enabled at the same time as FreeSync or adaptive sync, I think you could get close. But with it set to the overdrive normal setting, you can see on the UFO test that there is 1 to 1.5 frames of trailing edge ghosting, and it takes 1 to 2 milliseconds for the next frame to go from starting to be drawn to fully drawn, fully crisp. Don't get me wrong, that's still great, that's still a great result to see, but it's not quite the 1 millisecond that they're quoting. Interestingly, if you set overdrive to off, there really isn't that much of a difference. You can still see that pretty much the same amount of trailing edge ghosting, and I think it might take half to 1 millisecond longer with it off, so it's worth leaving it on medium or on normal, but it's not a massive difference. But then, if you switch it to extreme, Oh, that's a lot more different. Yeah, there's a lot more overshoot. In fact, it's pretty visible. You can see on the trailing edge, the literal inverse ghosting, the brighter image on the back end instead of it being darker. And that is noticeable in games with it enabled. It does mean that the panel, the sort of leading edge of the UFO does appear a little bit faster, but I can't say that that benefit is worth the visible overshoot that you get as a cost to that faster speed. As for the input lag, that's where this gets kind of interesting and a bit confusing. See, this is a 240Hz monitor. It's also G-Sync compatible, which means it should have been tested by NVIDIA, and it means that this should be a very fast monitor in that regard. But in my testing with my time sleuth, it reported a pretty abysmal 6.7 milliseconds at the top of the display. For some context, the Aorus FI27Q-X, which is a 1440p 27-inch 240Hz IPS monitor, reported around 2.3 milliseconds instead, and AOC's new 24G2ZU, which is a 1080p 240Hz IPS panel as well, just happens to be 24-inch instead of 27, well, that one only took 1.2 milliseconds. Comparing that to the 6.7, that's a pretty significant difference. Now, I have had some rather strange results from the time sleuth in the past, which is why I also test the total system or click-to-photon latency using NVIDIA's LDAT and playing in CSGO. That reported that the best average I got was around 36 milliseconds, which isn't the worst result I've had, but take a look at the graph to see those shots. It's incredibly inconsistent, with the lowest value being around 40 milliseconds, but the peaks are over 70. I actually ran this test multiple times, and it was actually worse on the other two runs. They averaged around 40 and over 50 milliseconds, and take a look at the graph from the 50 millisecond run. You're seeing that, right? The minimum response time I got was 30 milliseconds, and the worst was over 90. In fact, if you look at the sawtooth pattern, this is incredibly inconsistent and explains a lot about why I found it difficult to hit some of those shots that were more reaction time based, like the barn door shots. To give you some context, here is the chart that I had from the AOC 24G2ZU, and you can see that while there is still some variability, the swings are going from 15 to 30 milliseconds instead of from 15 to 70. And again, if you look at the standard deviation, if you want to look at it that way, the standard deviation for that run was around 5.7. But the standard deviation, that the best one that I could get from this Acer monitor was 15.8, and the worst was 23. So it's okay for gamers. It's not the best, it's not perfect, but it's playable enough. But since it has this fancy Delta E color accuracy sticker, it must be a really good balance of gaming and color accurate photo or video editing for on the side, right? Well, again, not quite. While it is color accurate to the sRGB spectrum out of the box, it doesn't actually cover 100% of the sRGB spectrum. It covered about 96%, about 80% of DCI-P3, which is okay, but it's far from the most impressive that I've seen out of a 27-inch gaming monitor. And that also glosses over the resolution, which again, if you are photo or video editing, 27 inches at 1080p is not a great experience, especially if you're working with more high-res content. For example, if I wanted to edit this video, which is filmed in 4K, that wouldn't look great on this monitor, and I would struggle to refine those fine details even in a smaller preview window, even zoomed in. You're still going to struggle compared to running 1440p or 4K. In fact, for the near £400 this is currently listed for, I can think of a number of other monitors that I would much rather buy or recommend instead. The first one that comes to mind is Acer's own VG271UP, which is also a 27-inch monitor. It's 1440p, 144Hz, and an IPS panel, and that comes in at around £130 less. Oh, and it's also much faster in input lag, a very similar sort of response time, and it's also a much wider color space, well over 100% sRGB, and actually about 95% of DCI-P3 as well. And sure, that monitor doesn't have the fancy stand that pivots on the base with a little sort of pointer as it turns left to right, and of course the full adjustability and tilt, height, and rotation for portrait mode, but again, you could buy a VESA arm to do all of that and still have money left over instead of buying this one. And if you wanted that fancy stand and you still want a 1080p 240Hz monitor, well again, you can still buy Acer's own XB273, what's it called, QGX? That's the basically same monitor, but in a 25-inch form factor instead of 27. Or if you wanted a nice middle ground between the VG271UP and this one, you could buy something like the Gigabyte M27Q, which is a fantastic 170Hz 1440p monitor, and again, that has much better colors and basically every other stat. For me, this monitor is incredibly confusing. And not just because the XB273 name applies to both 1080p, 1440p, and 4K monitors, and all of those can either be 144Hz or 240 or 165. Not just because of that, but because I can't work out who this is for. Who would want a 1080p 240Hz monitor that's 27 inches and is IPS and is Delta E color accurate, but also doesn't even cover 100% of the sRGB spectrum? I cannot understand who this is for, and so if you have any suggestions, I would love to hear them in the comments down below, because I do not understand, but I would definitely like to. And with that said, I think that's my thoughts. I think you've thoroughly heard those, but I would love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think of this XB273 GX? Is this a monitor you pick up yourself, or would you pick up the 1440p 240Hz version, or the 1440p 165Hz, or 1440p 144Hz version, all with pretty much the same name? Feel free to let me know in the comments down below. If you do want to pick up one of these, or the VG271UP, or the Gigabyte M27Q, I'll be leaving links to them all in the description down below that you can check out. There will be Amazon affiliate links that will take you to your local Amazon store, where you can see pricing when and where you watch this, because it can and does vary, and hey, maybe pick one up yourself too. Otherwise, that is pretty much it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification icon if you want to see more videos like this one on a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday basis. And feel free to check out the rest of the links in the description down below. You can actually use the YouTube join button now if you want to support the channel, get access to our Money Mid Discord chat, sponsor free videos, and some cool emojis to use in the comments and on our weekly live streams. Or you can support on Patreon instead. There's also merch hoodies or t-shirts like this one, or a load of other cool designs I designed myself, or a load of other things like Overclock's your key affiliate links if you're buying from there, VPN options, Humble Bundle, Streamlabs OBS, and a whole lot of other stuff, so do feel free to check it out. And there'll be plenty of other videos on the end cards as well, maybe the VG271UP if you want to check that one out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it, I'll see you on the next video.